The Edmonton Oilers just made the Stanley Cup final and came within a game of winning it all. That doesn't mean the draft doesn't matter.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everybody who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So today's episode came from a very simple idea. I realized I hadn't done an episode about the Oilers draft, which the NHL draft was 2 weeks ago, and the important information has already been distilled out there. And as fully disclosed, I am not a prospects guy. I do not watch amateur. I do not watch European hockey. So I would not be giving you anything particularly enlightening, and I would rather speak from a position of authority. So that way I know what I'm talking about, as opposed to just regurgitating what other people have already said. So the first segment, our opening segment, we're going to talk about what the draft represents philosophically as an organization. We're also going to dive into the Oilers' organizational philosophy, at least as it pertains to the Ken Holland administration of handling the draft, player development. And then the last segment, we're just going to touch briefly on some of the guys the Oilers drafted this past draft in 2024. So let's get on into it. So when you are a good team, when you are consistently in the postseason, when you are consistently picking in the 20s, or in this case in the 30s, you are drafting for 2 or 3 years down the road. You are not drafting for need when you are picking 27th overall, or in this year's case, 32nd overall. And yes, I know the Oilers had to trade up to get back into the first round because they had traded their first round pick to the Ducks. But organizationally, when you're not picking in those first 5 picks of the draft, you should be assuming that guy's at least 2 years away from playing in the NHL, whether they're in college, junior, or over in Europe. You got to assume it's going to be at least 2 years for those guys to come over. And that's why you shouldn't draft for need. That's why you draft for organizational depth. And I know it's hard for people to conceptualize all of this. And frankly, only the most intense hobbyists and serious media people are able to keep track of all of this. And I don't even consider myself one of those people. I do the best I can as one person with the resources I have, which are just Google Sheets, spreadsheets. But trying to keep in line, trying to understand just where an organization is coming from and how they're thinking about the draft, it's tricky, because the draft is one of those opportunities where you really get to understand what a GM, what a president, what an organization thinks the team needs, especially going forward. It's very rare that you will see a team draft for an immediate need. You know, if you're picking first, second, third overall, maybe you can get away with doing that if you need a center, if you need a defenseman. But for the most part, most teams are drafting for 2 or 3 years down the road. Some teams are assuming these guys are not going to sign their entry-level contract for 2 or 3 years. And roster turnover in the NHL, it depends on the organization. You know, some teams like the Islanders, it's 2 players out, 1 player in every summer. And then there are teams, you know, like the Hurricanes, where it's 6 guys in, 6 guys out every summer. So the draft represents an opportunity to turn over your organization. And what I mean by that, every team starts with 7 picks. There are 7 rounds in the draft. You start with 7 picks. NHL teams are allowed to have 50 contracts on the books. Every draft represents an opportunity to turn over 1/7 of your team for free. You don't have to give up draft picks. You don't have to acquire them. All you have to do is have money. Whether they're in the AHL, whether they're on ELCs, whatever, you're allowed 50 contracts. You can turn over 1/7 of that, 7 spots, in a given year. If you're a bad team, you know, you're the Sharks, you're the Ducks, you're the Blackhawks, you're going to try and turn over 14, 15, maybe even 20 of those 50 spots, where you're going to do what the Coyotes have done, where you're going to trade for a bunch of draft picks and you're going to have 12 picks in one draft because you're trying to turn over not just your NHL roster. You're trying to turn over the entire organization. And when you are a really good team, like the Oilers, like the Lightning, like, I don't know, the Bruins, teams that trade at the deadline every year, the Rangers that trade at the deadline every year, that don't have first round picks often, don't have second round picks often, those teams are not looking at the draft for that. Teams like the Oilers, the Bruins, the Rangers, the Lightning, they're looking at the draft to try and fill out the organization. They are looking, can this guy be a fifth defenseman? Can this guy be a ninth forward? Can he be a penalty kill guy? And can this be a developmental goalie that we stash over in Europe? And then he comes to the AHL and then he plays 3 years in the A. And then when we're ready, he's going to be a backup to our starter. And then maybe he can graduate into a tandem. That's the way good teams use the draft. If you are not consistently picking in the first 30 picks, where the vast majority of NHL games come from, you have to find ways to fill out your depth. Because let's be honest, if a guy's in the third round, if he's in the fifth round, there's a reason. It's he needs time. He only has certain skills. Maybe he's, a 2-skill guy and you think you might be able to refine it to get it to a third skill. When you think about it in terms of skating, playmaking, physicality, defense, size, whatever 5 traits you want to use, most guys in the first round, they're going to have four of those 5 skills. Some might have 5 if you're a really good prospect. But the further down the draft you go, the less likely those guys are to turn into anything of note. And when you are a good team, because you're drafting not for need, because you're not drafting to fill in holes, because you're drafting in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round, your responsibilities in the draft are different than, say, what the Sharks are trying to do, what the Ducks are trying to do, where they're trying to build out the foundation of their team. The Oilers have their foundation. The Oilers are trying to use the draft to maintain a window of competitiveness by using cost-controlled talent. That's the key when you are a really good team. You want to use the draft to get guys in on entry-level contracts to allow you to pay your stars the most money you possibly can. You want to be able to pay McDavid and Draisaitl whatever they want. And then you're going to need, a cheap 4th line. You're going to need a cheap 3rd defensive pair. And the Oilers have opted this past season and this upcoming season to go with experience. Corey Perry, Derek Ryan, Sam Carrick. They have opted for expensive veterans, guys like Connor Brown, who have upside, but at the same time, they're older and they're not as expensive as your prototypical 4th liner or 3rd liner, who's going to probably command about $3 million on the open market. Corey Perry, Connor Brown, Janmark. None of those guys are making a ton of money this upcoming season. So it's not as unbearable. Where teams get into trouble, especially a team like Edmonton that's been close a couple of times now, they try everything to find that last piece, the secret sauce, the right combination of intangibles and grit that they feel gives them a better chance, because they can't add high-end talent. If the Oilers could, they would have added Steven Stamkos and Jonathan Marchessault. If there was no salary cap, the Oilers would have did everything in their power to get Steven Stamkos to play right wing with Connor McDavid or Draisaitl, and they would have said, we'll figure out the chemistry and the fit later. That's a good player. We want as many good players as possible. Being that there's a salary cap, the Oilers have to get creative. They have to get veterans on those cheap contracts. And going forward, the longer we go with the team built around McDavid and around Draisaitl, you're going to need these entry-level contract guys. You are going to need reclamation projects like Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson. And you are going to need old guys who are ring chasing, like Corey Perry, like Adam Henrique, to willingly take less money to come to your team, because you need as much money as you can possibly have to pay your stars. Coming up next on Locked On Oilers, we're going to talk about the Oilers' last 5 NHL draft classes. Conveniently, that is the beginning, 2019, and the end, 2024, of the Ken Holland era in Edmonton. So stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. It's summer. That means barbecues, the beach, and of course, baseball. I myself am recording this episode a little bit earlier on Friday afternoon because I will be at Citi Field tonight to see the Mets to get the Brandon Nimmo bobblehead. And I got my tickets, the only place I buy tickets, from Gametime. with some of the best features in the ticket buying industry. Things like zone deals, where you can save more by choosing a section and let Gametime choosing the seats. All-in pricing, where they show you the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. The seat views, my personal favorite. Get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. I want to be able to see home plate. I want to be able to tell what's a ball, what's a strike. I don't want to be blocked by a batter, whether they're left or right-handed. I want to see the plate if I am at a baseball game. The lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. And Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you to everybody who's hanging out on this Friday afternoon, listening to this or watching this episode of Locked On Oilers, where you've got your team covered every day. So it's not a secret. It's very well known that part of Ken Holland's undoing in Detroit, and ultimately probably why he jumped ship for Edmonton from Detroit, was the longer they were removed from the Stanley Cup wins of the early 2000s, the Red Wings did not turn over their organization. The Red Wings did not put themselves in a position to continue being competitive seriously. You know, you look at their history last decade, you look at their picks, you look at their franchise success last decade, and after though they won the Stanley Cup in 2008, they began a gradual decline. They went to the Stanley Cup final the following season in 2008-2009. They, of course, lost to the Penguins in 7 games. They went to the second round twice. They lost in the first round. They lost in the second round. And then they lost in the first round 3 straight years. And they haven't been to the playoffs since that last time they lost in the first round. And they did not draft well at the end of the late 2000s and into the 2010s. You know, there are okay NHL players in these picks. You know, Gus Nyquist has carved out a nice career. Nick Jensen has carved out a nice career. Thomas Tatar has carved out a pretty solid NHL career. Riley Sheahan played a long time, wasn't particularly that good. Kyle Yarncroc, I don't think ever played a game for Detroit. Peter Mrazek, a solid NHL goalie, but nothing special. Thomas Yurko, Alan Quine, Xavier Ole, Andreas Athanasiou, Tyler Bertuzzi, and Anthony Mantha are solid NHLers. Dylan Larkin, of course, is a pretty good NHL player, but they picked really high a lot towards the end of that period. You know, Evgeny Svechnikov, 170 games, Janusz Chwalski, 100 games, Michael Rasmussen isn't very good, Philip Zadina and Joe Veleno both aren't very good. So my point is, if you are going to maintain being competitive, which Detroit was trying to do, you know, until Datsuk and Zetterberg both retired, Detroit was very much still trying to be competitive. They had guys like Kyle Quincy, which brings a laugh to my face for a long-running inside joke from playing the EA Sports NHL franchise a lot, because it always seemed like there was a Kyle Quincy in every pack in Hockey Ultimate Team. But guys like Kyle Quincy, guys like Justin Abdelkader, who were holdovers that played with Nick Kronwall, with Lidstrom, with those guys. And other than Dylan Larkin, nobody that really transitioned between the two teams was that good. Like, the Red Wings were fine, but other than that, not a whole lot to show for it. And part of the flaw with that was they were consistently picking the teens, the low teens, like 11th or 12th. They were never bad enough to pick really high, other than the year they took Seider. They did get Lucas Raymond in there. Those guys are good, but those aren't franchise-altering players. And that brings us to Edmonton. So we all know that Ken Holland liked to slow play guys, that he really wanted guys to marinate in the AHL so that when they got to the league, the NHL, they were already ready to go. There was no development curve. There was no, oh, he needs to figure out. It was, this guy's played 2 years in the AHL. He's ready for the NHL. Let it rip. And Well, I understand that that might have worked, 15, 20 years ago. I think it was also unrealistic for where the game is going because it puts such an emphasis on short windows because you have to make executive decisions about these guys by the time they're 24 or 25 because of the way contracts are structured. You sign that 2 or 3 year entry level contract, depending when you sign it. If you're 18, 19, or 20, it's 3. If you're 21, it's 2. You sign that contract, you instantly go on the clock. If you're a good player, when that first contract, that entry level contract expires, your team's going to give you a long-term deal. You look at Uri Slafkovsky, who's the most prescient, obvious, recent example of young player who, instead of getting a bridge deal into their mid-20s, the team said, we think you're good and we think you're going to keep getting better. Here's an investment in you. We're going to pay you a lot more now because it's going to save us money down the road. The problem with keeping guys in the AHL for 2 years, burning a year or two off their entry-level contract, and then bringing them up is that you don't have a sample. You don't know if a guy is good or not. So then you spend the next 2 years evaluating how they play in the NHL. And that's how you get to a 25 or 26-year-old that has 200 NHL games and plays at a quarter point per game basis. They have 51 points and 211 career games. And there are some flashes of good player, but I don't know if you're really going to be a building block piece. And that brings us to Edmonton. So yesterday, when I was doing show prep for today, I went and logged every single Oilers draft pick for the last 5 years, not including this year, because obviously these guys, they were drafted 2 weeks ago, so they don't have NHL games, so we can't talk about them in relation to their other picks. But here are the keynotes. Over the last 5 years, the Oilers have had 8.3 picks per year. So they've picked more picks than the average team has during that time period. That means there were some drafts where they had 9 or 10 or 11 picks, and then there were drafts where they had like 3 picks. The average draft pick position of an Oilers draft pick over the last 5 years is 127, which, if you can do the basic math, that's between the 4th and the 5th round. It is very hard to get tangible pieces from the 4th and 5th round of the draft. We go further down the list. Only 7 picks in the top 3 rounds the last 3 years. So that means 2 picks, basically, in the top 3 rounds each of the last 3 years overall. It is hard when you are not picking in the 1st and 2nd round to translate those guys into NHL caliber players. The average Oiler draft pick over the last 5 years has played 7 games. Only 3 Oiler draft picks have played at least 1 NHL game for the Oilers. Philip Broberg, Dylan Holloway, and Savoie's brother, who's been here for a few... Raphael Savoie, excuse me, I forgot his first name. It took me a minute to jog my memory. 5 years, the Oilers have put 3 guys into their group. That does not seem like a group that is going to be able to sustain long-term. And that makes sense. And you think about what we were talking about at the outset, the idea that you want to use, as a good team, you want to use the bottom half of your draft. You want to use the bottom half of drafts, the end of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, etc. You're trying to find specialists. You want 3rd liners, you want 4th liners, you want 5th and 6th defensemen. That's why the Oilers are so veteran laden. They have not picked well in those drafts. They have not been able to translate draft picks into roster players. And some of that is a conscious organizational decision by Ken Holland and the Oilers people to slow play those guys. And that's why you have Connor Brown and Corey Perry and Matthias Janmark and Brett Kulak and Cody Ceci, as opposed to a 2nd round pick who spent 2 years in Ontario in the OHL and then is ready to play as your 10th forward because they've got some ruggedness to their game. But that'll just about do it for the 2nd segment of today's episode of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. So stick around. We'll do quick cliff notes on some of the guys the Oilers drafted this past year, coming up next. Thank you to everybody who's hanging out on this Friday. Hopefully you have a nice weekend ahead of you, whether it's fun, whether it's rotting. I know for me, I'm going to play a lot of Xbox. I'm going to catch it. I am going to binge watch The Bear and really try and unplug a little bit for the weekend, because next week's going to be a busy one because big plans later in the week. So got to crunch a lot of work in Monday through Wednesday. So A lot of what I'm about to tell you, I've aggregated from other people. I've texted a few people who are more in tune with the draft, who know these guys a little bit better. But the big thing that I always advocate for when it comes to the draft, I don't care about safe. I know a lot of general managers love the 50, 60 point two-way forward who they can drop into the middle six and is a solid NHLer who's never going to make a ton of money, but is a solid two-way player. Because those guys hang around, you have a competitive team, and you stay in the mix and you don't get fired. The counterpoint to that is the draft is your one opportunity to really try and identify ways of improving your team. And it's entirely incumbent upon you, your amateur scouting, and then your professional development. Can you translate raw talent into NHL caliber production? Like we just talked about, the Oilers have only graduated 3 picks in the last 5 years to their NHL roster. 2 of those guys, Broberg and Holloway, they look to be guys. Broberg is going to probably start out on the second pair playing top 4 minutes. And Dylan Holloway, conservatively, is going to be penciled into your top 9 and has top 6 upside. He was pretty good in stretches in the postseason playing with Draisaitl. I think Dylan Holloway has potential to be a top 6 forward, but he's going to need to ride shotgun with somebody who's a little bit more refined in terms of puck skills because he's a good skater, but his shooting, his playmaking, they're not upper echelon, so that means he's probably going to need a little bit of help to manufacture offense. So as far as the guys they took last year, Sam O'Reilly, 32nd overall. My only real thought, aside from what I'm about to read you from the scouting report from HockeyDB, I do wish the Oilers didn't have to trade draft picks next year because they don't have a first round pick next year and they don't have a second round pick next year. And that feels a little... Again, the Oilers need to find ways to find value in the draft so they can turn guys over. You know, last year they only had 3 draft picks. The year before that, they only had 4. The year before that, they only had 5. Excuse me, they only had 6. You need draft picks to fill out your organization. Think about draft picks, especially after the first round. Think of them as lottery tickets. You want to have as many cracks at it as you can, because if you conservatively can turn 2 guys from a draft class into NHLers, not even good NHLers, just NHL caliber players, that's a good draft. You do 3, great draft. You get 1 star and just an NHLer, elite draft. You go and look around the league and how rosters are built. For the most part, the foundational pieces are original draft picks. Those are the way to keep costs down. You need to nail your draft picks. The Oilers have nailed their big draft picks. McDavid, Draisaitl alone, you've got a playoff team. Just those 2 guys alone, you should be a playoff team every year. You've also drafted Nugent-Hopkins. I know that's a very different administration and a very different league, but Nugent-Hopkins is a top 6 caliber NHL player. Ryan McLeod was a top 6 caliber player that was playing on the third line because the Oilers' top 2 centers are very good. Then you look at the defense. You talk about Nurse, who is not a top 4 defenseman in the NHL anymore, but was once upon a time. Evan Bouchard, who's a very good player. And it brings me to one other thing I wanted to talk about in the last segment, but forgot. So we'll get back to this year's draft picks in a minute. But if you're not a good drafting team, I have no qualms with trading. You know, the Oilers traded 2 first-round picks for Mattias Ekholm. I know one of them was a player, but Reed Schaefer was a first-round pick, and they traded a first-round pick the following season for Mattias Ekholm. And Ekholm has been worth a lot more than whatever those 2 picks would have been to this team, because it's very clear those picks would not have made the NHL, but yet because of the way the Oilers have handled their draft picks. So I have no problem if you want to trade your draft picks if it's for constructive reasons. If you have to trade picks because you're making bad contracts go away, that's bad. That you don't want to be doing. You don't want to be in a position like the Lightning are in, like the Rangers are in, where you have to make your mistakes go away. One last thing. So circling back, the thing about Sam O'Reilly, anyone who plays for the London Knights knows when you're younger, you know, you're 18, 17, you're not going to get top 6 minutes. But the one thing that is encouraging was he did get to kill penalties as a young guy. So that's encouraging. The thing I know And this is going to sound very reductionist and simple, but if you don't put up good counting stats in junior hockey, you're probably not going to put up counting stats in the NHL. And that might seem a bit one-dimensional, a bit simplistic, especially for me, who's a big evidence guy. But anecdotally, if you're not dominating at the OHL level in terms of possession and counting stats, you're probably, you can be a good NHL player, but you're never going to be an 80, 90 point guy if you're not dominating at the OHL level. And obviously, if you're picking in the back half of the first round, you're probably not going to be turning guys like Sam O'Reilly into Connor McDavid's. If they were, they'd be going first overall. But there's an opportunity because as McDavid and Draisaitl get older, maybe you want to shift them to wing the way the Oilers did with Stamkos, the way the Rangers might with Mika Zibanejad, to reduce their workload, to allow them to focus on offense. And if you have a great play-driving winger, the responsibilities for that center will dissipate. They won't have to do as much. And if they've got good defensive instincts and they've got a well-roundedness to their game, that can make up for the lack of counting stat production. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you are watching over on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell. Leave me a note. Who is the best Oilers draft pick of the last 5 years? I will talk to you guys on Monday. Till then, everybody have a safe, fun weekend. Let's go Oilers.